see my screen? If someone could just give me a thumbs up. Fabulous. Okay, cool. And so, yeah, so we're excited to get started. I was thinking we could just start off with a quick layout of the format of the session today. We're going to have the first half an hour be two introductory context-setting presentations. I'll be leading the first one, and Forum for the Future will be hosting the second one. We'll then kind of be having a little bit of a working session to look at two different scenarios for resilient futures. We were originally meant to go into breakout groups, but I think given the number of participants we have, we'll kind of stay as one group and kind of talk through these different scenarios and reflect on them. And then we'll have about half an hour for a moderated discussion with two distinguished panelists before closing up in 2 hours. I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists for the day. Iromi Pereira is a Colombo-based researcher and activist. She works on land rights and spatial justice with a focus on development and dispossession in post-war Sri Lanka. She is the founder and director of the Colombo Urban Lab and the Asia consultant for the Bank Information Center in Washington, D.C. Karina Angelou is a principal design strategist and brings a decade of experience in deploying design features and system approaches to a wide array of complex challenges, from ocean plastics to urban resilience. Originally an architect, Karina's work at Forum encompasses the design and facilitation of multi-stakeholder collaborations, such as One Less Bottle and EU Innovate. More recently, Karina has been working on capacity building and coaching of teams and organizations to cultivate their capabilities for systems change. And this moderated discussion will be led by Dr. Vikram Mathur, the founding director of Transitions Research. Just a few housekeeping rules during the presentations and the moderated discussion. It would be really great if people who aren't speaking will stay on mute to avoid disruptions. We do have a chat box, and I'm sure people will be monitoring it in case any questions come up. And really quickly, Transitions Research, I'm sure Forum will present their organization in the next presentation, but Transitions Research is a Goa-based social science research collective, and we study 4 radical transitions that'll shape India's long-term future: climate change, urbanization, digitalization, and the future of food. And we aim to bridge the gap between new knowledge, public policy, and societal action. Cool. So just to get started, I'd like to kick off our first presentation by introducing everyone to urbanization and what's happening in South Asia. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the subject, urbanization is happening at an unprecedented rate. Between 2000 and 2010, 130 million new people moved into cities in the region. That's larger than the entire population of Japan. Between 2020 and 2050, it's projected that 570 million new people are likely to move to cities. That would be the 3rd largest country on its own. And much of this urban growth is taking place outside of the megacities that have come to define urbanization in the region. Much of this growth is taking place in smaller, mid-sized urban areas, sometimes on the fringes of other cities, but also in large villages and smaller cities. And most of this growth has been unplanned and messy. And this has resulted in the fact that many urban dwellers live in substandard housing. They have very few basic services and amenities like electricity and water, and they're likely to be breathing some of the world's most toxic air. And these conditions, along with limited economic opportunities and a lack of social safeguards, make many urban residents, especially the urban poor, extremely vulnerable to growing shocks and stresses, including climate impacts. And this is important because the region is extremely high risk to climate change. As you can see by this map, which was prepared for the Global Climate Risk Index 2021 by Germanwatch, the region is extremely vulnerable. India is the 7th most at-risk country in the world to climate change. And the 2021 index also put Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan within the top 10 countries for being at risk in the long term. Sorry, I'm getting notifications that people are in the waiting room. Oh, they're gone. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is the region is extremely at risk. A lot of the countries will be facing many different climate impacts. And this has profound impacts for cities. Cities are rapidly growing And it's really important that we think about ways that the people living in these cities will adapt to these conditions. We know that there are a variety of effects, from flooding, cyclones, and heat waves, which are shocks, short-term events. But there are also long-term stresses like
Anyone here, Shali? She's just joining again from her hotspot. In a minute. With us a second, folks. Those ubiquitous technology challenges.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yes, I'm so sorry. My electricity went off. I've joined from my hotspot. So hopefully there should be no more disruptions. Let me just get back to sharing my screen. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm hoping you all can see my screen. Yes, I'm keeping my video off just for bandwidth purposes, y'all. But basically, right, because the region is rapidly urbanizing, it's really important that we take into account the types of climate impacts that the region will be facing, because cities will need to learn to adapt and live with these new impacts. We have short-term shocks like flooding, cyclones, and heat waves, but we also have long-term stresses like various precipitation, drought, sea level rise, glacial melts, and even heat stress. And while we know some of these events, their intensity, frequency, and temporality are uncertain. And this poses a huge challenge for planning the region's future cities. But as the region cities develop, their futures must be imagined. And more likely than not, this is happening by a coalition of very powerful actors at varieties of scale. Take, for example, a global scale. The United Nations has the New Urban Agenda, where they're promoting inclusive and sustainable growth. At the national level, we see national governments like the government of India promoting smart cities, the use of technology for cities to become more livable and better places for people to be. And at the local scale, we see cities and subnational governments employing resilience as a worldview for imagining future cities. And these are often supported by global private and philanthropic actors. Take, for example, the 100 Resilient Cities program. But how do communities view their own futures? In her book, Between States of Modernity, Sheila Jasanoff defines social imaginaries, such as those of resilient cities, as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures. Now, this future-oriented approach suggests that these imaginaries not only envision future spaces, but they also pave the way for actions that co-produce them. While the prevailing narratives of resilience come from powerful actors, this doesn't mean that there aren't other contesting imaginaries of what resilient cities should look like. And we can take 3 different examples to explore this a little bit further. First, we have the case of the Great Garuda in Jakarta, outside of the South Asian region. But this large infrastructural plan was created by Dutch water experts, consultants, real estate developers, and government to make the city resilient to sea level rise and water-induced shock by building a massive seawall. Second, we have Baharia town. This is a satellite town that's currently being built outside of the city of Karachi with the purpose of decongesting the city. But in its marketing, we see the development says that there are new green spaces with golf courses and water bodies, despite being located in an extremely arid landscape. And third, we have Amravati, which was supposed to be the new capital for the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, which is also employing narratives of resilience and sustainability. by promoting modern infrastructure, being dependent exclusively on renewables, and having lots of green space and water bodies. And in all three cases, two of which, the Great Garuda and Amravati, which have been indefinitely halted, but in all three cases, locals have had to have been coerced into the participation of these villages. Slums and villages had to have been razed, promises of new homes have vanished, and fair compensation hasn't been actualized. So it's very clear that the imaginaries of these three future cities represent a worldview that's limited to a select group of people promoting these ideas. They've done very little to address the root causes of vulnerability in the region's cities that put large swaths of the population at risk, like insecure tenure, lack of basic services, and poor social safeguards. But it's also important to remember that the future is not just about climate. In his book, Falter, Bill McKibben talks about the human game and the scale of change that humans are causing to the planet. He, of course, talks about climate change, but he discusses the digitalization of society and economies as well. And when we think in terms of the context of cities, we see that urban systems are influenced by many different drivers of change. We have climate change, digitalization, most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, and these are also going to be changing and emerging, but they disrupt and change ways of living and doing. To address these existing and emerging drivers of change, we need integrated visions of resilient futures that talk not just about climate, but all different drivers of change. To do so, we need new methods centered around understanding people and the multiple imaginaries of resilience. We believe in exploring these new visions in the context of local power dynamics and the uncertainty around emerging and existing drivers of change through the use of scenarios and understanding existing mindsets and values. We propose that grassroots methods and approaches to understand local memories, histories, and place-based dynamics are used to provide less powerful actors with the opportunity to co-create their own visions, those with often challenge centralized narratives of resilience. We believe that these are extremely important to address root causes of vulnerability and address systems change. Therefore, think about integrated visions of resilience. So before passing the mic, I'd like to conclude with 3 key points. The first is that visions of resilient cities inevitably enroll future thinking. We have powerful actors who imaginaries have come to dominate and shape how action like policy, investments, and plans to dominate, we have powerful actors whose imaginaries have come to dominate and shape action through the use of plans, policies, and investments, and they use their worldviews to shape what the future should look like. But just because these are the dominant visions, that doesn't mean that they are the only visions. There are multiple imaginaries of resilience. They are inevitably political and very much highly contested. So we need to take a systems approach. We need to take a bottom-up approach to understand integrated visions of resilient futures, to understand how people want to live in cities and navigate the uncertainty of new shocks and stresses. With that, I would like to conclude, and I'll pass the mic to Anna. I think you're going next, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to address them in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shali. Excellent. Let me just share the presentation. That was very well recovered from the technological blip. Thank you. So, hi, I am Anna Warrington, or Anna Biswas, depending on what avatar you know me in. And I'm here with my colleagues Yamini and Ashley Karina, who you'll hear from in a moment, from Forum for the Future. We work to catalyse change in key systems from food to energy from our offices that are spread across the world. So in Mumbai, which is where Yamini and I are based, Singapore, London, where Karina is, and New York. One of the practices and sets of approaches that we use to catalyse this change is futures. And we're here to kind of give a bit more detail on what that is and why. Ashali has already hinted at this, but the power of futures is not only transformative, but necessary in our current context. We'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by futures and why it's relevant for adaptation, but Ashali has made some really excellent points already. We'll then actually go into playing around and experimenting with one technique to see how it could be useful for you in your work. And it's actually rather nice that we're a small group, as we'll get to have a proper conversation about how best to put this kind of work to work in your work in adaptation, given all the experience in the room. So thank you for joining us. So futures or future studies or foresight is an interdisciplinary field of researching, crafting and instrumentalizing visions of possible, probable and preferred futures based on specific methods, models and theories. The use of futures, plural, rather than future, singular, is intentional. There is no one future that we are certain about, and different people will experience the same future in different ways. Hence the need to explore many different alternative futures. Storytelling to share observations about changes in the world, explore the consequences, explore possibility, teach and learn lessons is something that we have been doing for at least 30,000 years. So futures techniques have long roots actually in the past. The power of good futures is in creating a deep connection, an almost visceral connection that guides our decision-making and influencing towards the future we want. It's about unlocking possibility through an appropriate blend of data, imagination, and stories, using that to explore the different possible futures ahead of us, inquire into the future we really want, and better understand what we are doing and need to be doing now to bring it about. You probably see for yourself already why we think it's so important in the field of adaptation. As Canopy puts it, if we can't imagine it, we can't make it happen. We believe that without new and shared imaginations, our society will stay stuck in its current destructive and unequal patterns. We know that all of us are deeply imaginative, but society is not set up to support us to imagine together. As a result, the future is always being built based on imaginations that are incomplete, one-sided, disconnected. This is what we seek to change. We seek to create the conditions for new shared imagining, new stories, and new action for a better world. I think that point about whose imagination and whose vision is key to locally led adaptation. In this world of increasing uncertainty, a futures mindset is not just helpful, it's critical. Anyone can be a futurist to some extent. By noticing changes happening in the world around you, you'll be better equipped to help shape the future as it comes, rather than just react to it. It helps you navigate the waves of change that are breaking over us and growing on the horizon. You may not be able to predict by any means, but you can be more nimble to the different futures that come your way. Ooh, sorry. There are many different futures approaches and techniques. Some of the key ones that we use in our work to catalyze change are horizon scanning, where we keep our eyes raised to see the micro and the niche changes in our context, as well as the macro trends that shape it, and design interventions that amplify the good that we're seeing in signals of change. Collective visioning, where we bring different people with very different perspectives on a particular challenge together to collectively understand and articulate the future they all want. And scenarios, where we explore the different possible ways the future could play out to spot risks and opportunities for transformative systemic change. This is just a few of the many that get that can be employed. And I'll just hand over to my colleague Yanni and take it on from here.
Thank you. So why use futures at all? Futures is basically an approach that helps us understand that big picture context, understand the nature of change, how does change happen? And it helps us to work with uncertainty. And we can use that to see what elements we would want to see in our future and what we want to work towards and design goals around that. It also helps us explore the interdependence of issues, helps us break through siloed ways of thinking and see connections. And we know that that's been a big area of challenge in the space of climate change, and the call for sort of a more systemic approach is definitely increasing. And it also surface and perspectives. So using futures is really an opportunity to look ahead from different perspectives and make our understanding richer and more nuanced. And finally, futures approaches help us come together and engage more creatively in thinking about challenges and how we might approach them. So that's why we think futures could be relevant. And then moving on, there is, of course, the question of what makes for a good futures process. If we can move to the next slide. We know that the future will not be like the present. We are all experiencing different versions of the future depending on where we are and who we are. For some people, the future is very exciting. It's growth oriented. It's full of exciting technological advances and possibilities. For others, it's very dystopian. Rising seas are threatening our homes and livelihoods. There is no question of basic technology to deal with that. So there are multiple futures, and people do experience different elements of what makes for a good. If we move to the next slide. Sorry, thank you. So the first one is that we know that the future, while it may be born of today's trends, it is likely non-linear. It's not straightforward and apparent. Elements of the future can shape up suddenly and very differently to what a few quotes. And these are examples of how change did not happen in a predictable, knowable way. So what made perfect sense at the time really seems off the mark now when we look back at what happened. So it's not immediately knowable. It's not immediately predictable. It is very likely non-linear. And then another element, if we move on to the next page, another element of a good futures approach is that it is not just from one viewpoint. And of course, like this is what Ashali spoke about and what Anna's also spoken about just now. And here's a picture. So for many of us, when we think of the future, we think of an image like this one, a lot of bright and shiny new technology, an overall better life. Everything looks, picture perfect almost. But what is it that this image is omitting? What we're seeing is that there is a lone person walking their dog. Where are the families? Where are the communities? Where are the animals? What does this picture mean for different types of people? Is this a gated community? Is it an average city anywhere in the world? So much of the focus that when we think of the future is on new technology, but it is important to see the future as a whole in which technology is just one component. Many things will likely be different about the future. So how can we use thinking about the future includes everybody? So therefore, it is important to view the future from multiple viewpoints. And if we move on to the next page, another element of a good futures approach is that it acknowledges the futility of prediction. And that you're seeing right now, this is a visual of the multi-level perspective framework, which is a tool to look at complexity. And what it's showing over here is one lens of understanding is understanding what is happening in the mainstream day-to-day, everyday context, which is what is labeled here as the regime.
Yamini, I think your bandwidth might be a bit low. I don't know whether you want to turn off your video.
Context of landscape, and then also looking at what I will. Sorry about that. Let me know if this isn't better. And the other part of this is also looking at what's happening in the margins of the mainstream, the edges, such as new social or technological innovation, the niche. So this is just one example of a tool that acknowledges complexity and works with page goes much deeper. And like all good storytelling, it looks into why things happen and how we could make a difference. So what you're seeing here is something called the iceberg model. It's a tool that helps us dig deeper And we will be actually applying that and using that in a short while from now. But as you can see, it's basically a tool to unpack what we see as surface level events and go all the way down to what are the structures and the patterns and the relationships that underlie this. And below that, what are the mindsets, the assumptions, the worldviews that are kind of informing all of those structures and patterns? What are the feelings at play? So all of these elements sort of come together to make a good futures approach. If we move to the next page. So why use futures in the context of climate adaptation? Now, we know that we are at a critical time for adaptation to climate change. And unfortunately, images like these have become all too common. Climate change is already affecting the natural world and human well-being, and it has already caused irreversible impacts at many levels. And we know that there is a window of opportunity for keeping sort of global rise in temperature within non-catastrophic limits, but that window is closing fast. And there are signs of hope. There is increasing recognition and calls for transformative adaptation, for climate resilient development that combines mitigation and adaptation efforts. But at the same time, there are risks of adaptation responses going terribly wrong. Risks of maladaptive responses that can create lock-ins of vulnerability, exposure, and risks that are difficult and expensive to change and that exacerbate existing inequalities. So the question really is how we consider and how do we adapt and be resilient in a way that's inclusive and that considers multiple perspectives? How do we look at the big picture? How do we look at the interdependence of issues? How do we surface assumptions and mindsets? And how do we look at different ways in which adaptation might happen and what it might result in? And therefore, keep a lookout for consequences of the decisions that we make today, whether they are intended or unintended consequences. And how do we work through the scale and complexity and uncertainty of it all? So futures thinking is one approach that could help with it. Definitely, it's not a silver bullet, but it is a tool to work through that uncertainty and scale and complexity of the challenge that we're facing up to when it comes to climate change and responding to it. So we'll delve into exactly how we might use a futures approach now, and Anna will walk us through some of Forum's work here. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. Right, so, oh, sorry, I've got a very loud crow. Emily mentioned earlier how the mindset level of that iceberg can influence so much of what happens above it. Effectively, it is the mindset that shapes the entire imaginary, the entire world. At Forum, we've been exploring with our corporate, philanthropic and civil society partners how these mindsets might shape our trajectory from this moment if they become dominant. And we found that our thinking and transitions research thinking is very much exploring a sort of similar area. So at any one time, it's really important actually just to bear in mind that there will be multiple mindsets at play, but there will likely be one or two that become more dominant and therefore shape the future we experience. Loosely based on the work of futurist Jim Data, we are witnessing 4 different mindsets shaping possible trajectories forward from this point. We've called them transform, discipline, compete and retreat, and unsettled. I asked you to listen out, actually, for which ones you think are at play in Amravati, Great Garuda, and Bahia, as Charlie spoke through earlier on. So the first mindset is called discipline, and it sees greater control as necessary to maintain public health, safety, and security, and to keep growth and global flows of goods and relationships as normal. So this mindset is prepared to relinquish privacy concerns and actually other individual needs for this maintained state. As an example, you can see aspects of this in China in their response to climate COVID at the moment. The second mindset is discipline, which sees greater control as necessary. Is compete and retreat, which is the mindset based on the assumption that there is not enough to share. Scarcity mindset. We must retreat to protect our own kind, and our survival and prosperity comes ahead of the survival and prosperity of others. Now that might happen at an individual level, it might happen at a family level, it could happen at a community or a nation state. But that's the mindset behind the compete and retreat trajectory. The unsettled mindset is that there might never actually be a new normal, that the world now is kind of strange and radically different, and the future way forward is actually highly volatile beyond all previous human experience. So previous ways of thinking are just not helpful now. It's radical resilience, adaptability, and opportunism that jostle with fatalism and anxiety. There are some shoots of this that are happening in India at the moment. I'm sure you can imagine and imagine these yourself. The final sort of big dominant mindset I think that we're seeing in the world right now is the transform mindset, where planetary health and human well-being come first and are seen as deeply interconnected. So there's a recognition in this mindset that deep change to reset the system is possible, it's desirable, and it's happening, and we can't go back to the kind of before model of doing things. Now, whilst this can sound very positive to change agents like us, it does have its shadow side, where different theories of change can compete and time and energy can be lost in debating the best approach to transformation. Each of these different mindsets would result in radically different future approaches to adaptation. I'm sure you can imagine some of them now in your head, but by understanding these different possible futures for adaptation and what drives them, we can be more intentional in our work, helping the right mindset be deployed at the right time and helping others to explore the consequences of the decisions they make using certain mindsets. I'll hand over to Yamini to give you a few glimpses into possible futures for adaptation driven by these different mindsets I've just summarized.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are going to have a go at actually using this. It's been a lot of us kind of talking through what this is about, but let's try and experiment and apply some of this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do an activity together. So all of us working together in a group, where we are going to explore a couple of mini scenarios on adaptation responses to climate change impacts. So the scenario is going to sort of lay out the context for you, what's happening. And it's also going to lay out the mindset, the overarching mindset that's informing that situation. And we are going to use that and dig deeper into what is underlying those types of adaptation responses at multiple levels using the iceberg model. So we look at structures, we look at patterns, we look at mindsets to unpack all of it. And we have a good chunk of time. We have around 30 minutes to do this, and we'll all be in the same room and working through this together. So just to name what those two scenarios are, if we go to the next page, we have chosen for today two provocations, we are calling them, or mini scenarios. One is around climate proofing the city, and the other is about decentralized shifts. So small ground, bottom up decentralized shifts. And I'll get to that in a minute to explain what those scenarios are. And we are going to look at those using the iceberg model. And the objective really is for us to have a go at exploring how these mindsets inform the structures and patterns and actions related to climate adaptation, and understand where and why this might be relevant. And then after we've kind of worked through these scenarios, we'll reflect for a bit and have a discussion beyond the scenarios as well. So just to start taking you through this, the first mini scenario or provocation, as we're calling it, is called climate proofing the city. So this is a scenario where infrastructure and technology-based responses are the main ways in which adaptation is considered. So think of examples like building seawalls, strengthening bridges, using technology to predict, model and monitor risks and responses. And the mindset here is really, thinking that greater control is required to maintain public health and safety and security, and to keep growth and global interconnection going as normal. So this corresponds a lot to the disciplined mindset that Anna mentioned earlier. And this is really what's at play in terms of informing this approach. The other one, and sorry, just to stay with that for a minute, and I don't want to say too much because it's for us to explore, but it's basically for example things like governments and big funders working together to build huge projects or to model data and respond to it and enable all sorts of sort of technology systems to deal with and anticipate and respond to climate change. The other scenario, or the other provocation is about, sorry, if we can just go to the next page. This is about small ground up and decentralized shifts. So imagine a reflexive world where responses tend to be decentralized and contextualized. And the elements of the mindset at play here include a realization that, as Anna said a little while earlier, that there might not ever be a new normal. There are always changes, there is always uncertainty. The world is strange and volatile. Previous ways of thinking and making long-term plans just don't work. There's also the seed of thought that planetary and human health are interconnected and there needs to be deep change. So an element of looking for real transformation also informing is also part of the archetype here. So that's the other scenario that we're looking at. And in each of these, we are going to imagine that, it's 2040 and we're looking at cities that have adapted one of these archetypes in terms of their thinking. And we're going to keep a few questions in mind, which is, what signs of this future do we see now in the present today? And what does this future mean for different actors and different parts of the city, different aspects of city life? So really taking multiple lenses to look at the scenario. And if cities are thriving in this future, if it's worked out in a good way, what have we done today to make that possible? And that will help us think ahead as to what we need to be doing or should not be doing from now. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be using the iceberg to consider where this type of response works well, where it doesn't, who is making the decisions here, whose perspectives are being considered or not, what beliefs and assumptions are at play, are there blind spots here? And I do want to point out that obviously this is an exercise where we are using these mindsets as archetypes. At no point are we saying that there is only one archetype or one type of mindset at play, or we recognize that at any time there are multiple archetypes and mindsets at play. But the idea behind framing a few key archetypes of responses is just to enable us to explore more deeply the types of mindsets and assumptions that are held in approaching adaptation, and to see how actions and patterns and structures for climate adaptation are informed by such mindsets. So that's really the purpose of trying to simplify it a little bit. So what we'll do now is we will open up an online whiteboard that all of us will be looking at, and we'll sort of facilitate a discussion. And after that's done, we'll come back in plenary to reflect and have a bit of a panel discussion together. So I'll wait for Anna to share her screen.
Just one, Yamini, if I may intervene for a second.
Sorry.
Maybe it's also a good opportunity because we've had two presentations back to back and very rich content in both of them. It's a good opportunity to even, pause for 5 minutes, not pause in the sense, not like pause the process for 5 minutes, to just take some questions, clarifications, reflections on even the aims and objectives and what we're trying to do in this exercise. Like it'd be good to know what's the kind of sense around the room about this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and feel free to type in the chat. We're looking at the chat as well, and to sort of raise your hand and speak out here. Thanks, Vikram.
Yeah, I think we should take about 10 minutes to see if there are any questions at this stage. Oh, it was just remarkably clear. From any of our participants who have kind of joined specifically for this session, any questions, clarifications? Thoughts?
I see that Sanayana just raised her hand. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Pranansan, and I recognize that my spelling is not exactly the usual spelling, but I appreciate the effort. Thank you so much for the excellent two presentations and everything you guys said. So just for context, I work in the field of resilience, of course, but I specialize in communication systems, and we also take a systems-based approach. So really what I was fascinated to, well, more out of curiosity, this process that you all have been talking about, using the iceberg model and futures. I assume you work with multiple different kinds of stakeholders. So say government authorities on one side and communities on the other side, because you talked about participatory approach. So just out of curiosity, which group tends to engage with this model better? Like, I mean, where do you find this to be more successful? Like with which group?
I mean, I kind of just want to make one point, I think, and then I'll let Anna respond to this. But just my one point on this would be that in some sense, like I do see that these kinds of exercises are also critical for the kind of risk communication work that perhaps that you might be doing, right? So it's also, I think the context of some of these exercises is also the fact that we are faced with communicating somewhat uncertain realities and futures, right? So I think that's also the idea. So to that extent, I feel like, yeah, I mean, just wanted to say that even just sort of coming back to what you said was your core interest. I don't know if you have used these sort of exercises as a tool for communication. In my own experience, unfortunately, we end up doing, where I have been involved in scenario exercises, it is really quite very easy to do these with kind of people who are working uh, in the kind of analysis, think tank, research, or even the NGO space, right? Like, and it's somewhat harder with decision makers, but I think, yeah, it would be good to hear others' views on that.
I think you agree, Lisa. At least it can kind of completely, without sounding kind of too, it depends. It can actually really just depend on some of the individuals in the room. And we've had amazing experiences where we've managed to immerse kind of large senior teams in corporates in different possible futures where they've actually helped come up with those futures themselves. And they've been quite a transformative way of them thinking about what their role is in shaping the future, as well as how they respond to some of the risks and opportunities that might come up from different possible futures. I think if you go into a process like this with an open kind of, maybe with your kind of eyes up and raised above the horizon and into that with a willingness, you can achieve real difference here. And I'd echo Vikram your point about civil society. A few of us actually on this call have been involved with a project recently, looking at using techniques like this to explore different possible models for resilience for civil society here in India. And that kind of, was very helpful, and people are used to thinking in that kind of strategic way ahead. Where I think there are differences is that I think actually some governments work really well with different scenarios, but some don't, because they have kind of more urgent things to prioritize. They don't have the headspace to engage in kind of longer, deeper conversations, but others can. So I guess there's no kind of hard and fast rule, but I think it comes down really to who. I don't know whether, Karina, you might have thoughts on this as well, or anyone else to jump in, please do.
I can jump in with the reflection and almost kind of acknowledge the legacy of where a lot of these methods have come from, which is actually within the corporate space, in the 80s and the 90s, and they were being developed as methods to support corporate businesses and organizations to achieve future fitness, to really look at how can they adapt their strategies, their activities in the context of a changing world. And I think we have seen a lot of these organizations actually, managing to create that stability from themselves and also to profit from a lot of very different contexts. So I think a part of using these methods and using futures from my perspective is also reclaiming these methods and saying it's not just about corporate stakeholders and corporate organizations using these to ensure future fitness, but it's about how do we collectively imagine alternative futures? How do we talk about, and not just talk about, but actually do something about injustices and inequities, and how do we mobilize these different methods for our own purposes as civil society, as different stakeholders, as community organizations. So I think there is an interesting reclaiming of these methods that actually have a lot of their legacy in the corporate space.
Thanks, that was a great question. Thank you. Sada, I can see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hello, can I come in?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, thanks for your interesting presentation. I am thinking is different ways. The cities changing rapidly, and due to climate change related hazards impacts, lots of people are migrating from rural to urban, and that's creating inequality in social inequality in the city level, and that could be enhanced more and more in future. How the just transition can happen in this way? If you can give us some idea about on this and how to understand the changes situation to know the fair urban transition, that would be great help for us to understand from you.
Yeah, I can start by responding to that. Hi, Feather. It's nice to see you again, or talk from you again. I think one thing, it's very difficult to be able to predict, right? I think the second presentation talks a lot about the predictions. It's not linear, right? It's really difficult to be able to say that like 500 new people are going to come to this city and 10,000 people are going to come to that city. I think there are ways in which we can use tools to try and understand linkages and linked migration. But I think what's most important is that cities themselves become safe and welcoming to people who are coming. I also think it's important that adaptation efforts are happening in places in rural areas where people are also migrating from, trying to understand the challenges that are being faced there, to see do people actually want to leave? Are they moving to cities for better lives, or is something that's happening that we can try to address and solve? I think that's one way that we can look at it. But I think cities, in a way, when I talk about cities being systems and undergoing these drivers of change, in migration is a huge driver of change that cities across the region have to deal with. I don't think there's one policy answer or one easy way that they'll all be able to adapt. But I think cities need to start thinking about it now. They can't be in denial about the fact that this is happening, is likely to continue. And I think that's the first step in recognizing we need to provide for more people than currently live here. And I think in South Asia, one of the biggest challenges that I face working with local governments, and I mostly speak for India, is the fact that they're trying to do things on a day-to-day basis. That is, that we need to get water provision, we need to collect waste. It's like very much about day-to-day service provision and not as much thinking long-term or strategically about how these drivers of change are going to impact the future. And I think that's a shift that needs to happen amongst decision makers, but it needs to happen in an inclusive way. So that's my response to that. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. I don't need it from anyone.
I think that's a great point, thank you. The one thing I would say is that I think there will be no one response to inward and outward migration. And in a way, the tool that we're kind of talking about here is going to help us explore what those possible responses might be. So we could even use that as a framing question, actually a prompt question within this conversation we're about to have. Like, if we experience this mindset as being dominant, how will people be treated? How will they be planned for? Will they be planned for? What kind of a society will they find themselves in? And just kind of exploring the different possibilities of that will help us plan and influence far better. To manage the risk and to kind of actually, plant the seeds of opportunity. Any further questions before we get into that conversation? Really
I do
appreciate
think
this
in the
question.
interest of time, we should move to our working group.
All right. Shall I share the screen? Okay, so should I introduce these guys? I'm not sure. Or Vikram, do you want to?
No, I think go ahead.
Okay, so the sort of mini scenario or imaginary that we're using here is that climate proofing the city one that Yamini mentioned, where infrastructure and technology-based responses are the main ways in which adaptation is considered. So building sea walls, strengthening bridges, the kind of very sort of civil and kind of physical resilience approach. Potential here for very top-down approaches to be implemented. And the underlying mindset is very much of that kind of like, we really need to get control of this. And we're willing to sacrifice certain things to hold that control. So most city governments are now working with national governments and large development funders to build infrastructure that protects against severe climate impacts. Also, many cities are reliant on a range of disaster warning, response and monitoring systems. It's very kind of tech-led and risk-led. There are typically technology-enabled systems to collect data, model and predict, issue warnings and activate responses to specific events, such as cyclones or high heat waves. Municipal governments rely on these systems to anticipate and respond to severe events and to plan for the future. It's very much a kind of disciplined, greater control for the greater good kind of mindset. I guess the first question I guess I have is sort of, where are we seeing this currently in the response to adaptation? Keen to hear, from anyone actually, including the organizers. We're all here today. We'd really love to hear anyone's thoughts on where we're seeing this in the real world. But welcome back, Remy. I think you got chucked off. We're just talking about where this scenario in particular might actually be manifesting in real life. So the very kind of infrastructure and technology-based approach to or response to adaptation. Whether you have any examples of where this is manifesting already?
So, sorry, you got a little cut off in the middle. Could you repeat that, please?
Sorry, Remy. I was just wondering whether, from your experience of working in this field, where you had come across a kind of signs of this or kind of manifestations of this scenario happening in real life. So where the main focus is really on infrastructure and really on kind of technology and led approaches that kind of try and aim to have control over the city and over its response to climate change. So yeah, just interested in your reflection whether it's something you've experienced in real
life. Sure. Sorry, you're able to hear me, right? We are in the middle of a park cut, so my connection's not so great.
Yes,
So
we can
this,
hear you.
great. So I guess for us, at least with the work that we do here in Sri Lanka, I feel like we've been in sort of the technology and infrastructure um, sort of a focus sort of development or city building for a very long time, and without sort of any consideration to the environment or climate justice or even sort of spatial justice at any point. And I mean, I think if you were in Colombo right now, you would see that we are living through this kind of crisis right now where it is unbelievably hot. We're having a huge energy crisis. We're having an economic crisis, which sort of also then makes you question everything about the city, right? It is becoming unlivable. It has always been sort of more on the unlivable side for low-income communities, but here you're feeling it right across the spectrum. Today we're having 7 hours of power cuts right throughout the day. I'm on my 5th hour right now, and then it questions everything about the way we work, how we work, the kind of work that we do that is then so dependent on certain types of infrastructure and technology. And how did we get here? Given that there have been, and this is not something that we are experiencing brand new, right? For as long as I remember, for example, we've had droughts here. And electricity is reliant on hydropower. And Sri Lanka is a country that looking at types of energy sources, for example, like solar, without being complete hydro and the source here. And here I do feel like the disconnect has always been that policymakers and governments live a completely different reality to others. So whether it is, say, public transport, you don't see our government, say, parliamentarians or policymakers actively taking transport. They don't take the trains to work. They don't take the bus to work. So then if you don't actively use it yourself, you're not going to find ways to invest in them or know how to make it better. And I think the same applies for big infrastructure projects. More the show, like you'll rather have, like, for example, like a big tower or a extra large bridge with decorative things, or aesthetic designs that make it unique to a city, but may not be really what a city needs in that sense. You're looking at more of an aesthetic side as opposed to looking at what makes something more livable. And I think also this over reliance on technology and even this whole thing of smart cities, and we're always looking at how do you use a mobile app to make a city smarter, but we are not really looking at how can we make a city livable and not be completely reliant on technology or networks, that sort of thing. Sorry, I feel like my points are kind of all over the iceberg model here now that I'm looking at it. But maybe those are like my initial thoughts based on your model and your scenario.
That's really helpful. I wonder whether that sparked any thoughts for anyone else who'd like to add to Iromi's thoughts. Wonder whether we've got some quite quiet people.
I can come in and share some thoughts while others are reflecting. I think what Iromi was saying was making me think around a pattern that I see quite a lot, which is also at the institutional level. Like, I think our institutions and organizations really prefer and hold a lot of the times this mindset, because in a way it's the mindset that they were set up to perpetuate as well. So if we look at our international intergovernmental institutions, they were set up with this purpose to future-proof, so to create stability, to create institutional stability, to mediate. And I think there's something very difficult and against the grain to actually transform the worldviews that these institutions are holding, and how they translate into policies, into organizational norms, into behaviors. So I think your point, Iromi, about do the policymakers actually use the services that they are in charge of? How separated are they from the realities and also the different experiences of the different service users? And reflecting on the earlier question around migration, I think there's also something quite interesting in this mindset, which is around, we can control migration. We can tell people where to go, and we can put policies in place if that is even an option, and people will go where we tell them. But actually, that's not how human decision making happens. Like, people go where they have relatives, people go where they know people go where they have other communities that they can link to. So I think there's something that's very much against the grain of the behavioral and the emotional process when we look at an issue such as climate-induced migration. So yeah, I wonder if anyone else has thoughts or reflections, but these are just some of the things that I was reflecting while Iromi was speaking.
I like that speaks a little bit to your question of like, this is one response almost to the migration, is to assume you can control it and that people will go to places that are built for them, and actually it doesn't tap into the humanity of the people that are actually traveling and their actual human response. So yeah, I feel like that is one particular thing. Sunana and Shuchi, do you want to go ahead? And then Sunana, I saw you unmute, so I'll come back to you in a moment. Shuchi, go ahead.
Sure. So thanks. And I was also reflecting on I joined in between and wasn't really, which is why I took some time to sort of grasp. There's another very interesting session which is parallel to this one. That one's on knowledge brokering, and that's also fairly interactive. So I was trying to sort of balance times between the two sessions. Anyway, yeah, so I was just reflecting on this whole aspect of migration. And one of the, and while this was not climate change induced, but one of the biggest and the most visible sort of manifestations or unintended consequences of this whole mindset of the way migration works was the lockdowns that happened during COVID in India. And the way we saw masses moving towards villages. And these were all people who, typically migrate seasonally or typically migrate for jobs. And it's possibly, it's impossible to think of migration just in terms of one-way movement, because there was just so much that was going on and so many ways in which these people were impacted. So yeah, maybe just thinking about migration differently, as thinking about ways in which we can diversify support to people who need to migrate, and think of ways in which the economy moves differently. The whole aspects, the whole principles of resilience sort of come into play here. And if we start thinking about introducing redundancy in the system so that it supports them, so thinking of universal basic income as another way to support these people, or thinking about housing shelters, or something that the Delhi government has recently started is learning centers for children on the street. Various ways in which we can support. We can't necessarily halt migration as we saw with COVID, but we can definitely find various ways of support. And one good example was the National Employment Guarantee Scheme in India that was hugely successful during droughts in supporting livelihoods in rural India, and maybe controlling some amount of that migration as well. So yeah, diversifying income strategies and diversifying ways in which also, sorry, I'm rambling on this, but another aspect that came into my mind, and I was reading about this just today, and which is why this came up, was how this sort of links to various other issues. So drought issues in heavy drought in Marathwada in India, in Western India, has led to migration of predominantly women and young men to parts of Karnataka, to cities cities like Bombay, cities like Bangalore, and also other parts where they're cane cutters, sugar cane cutters, and they're basically being driven from what was a highly intensive sugarcane producing area to another area, which is again going through that same cycle of high production, water intensive production, might face drought, and are super vulnerable, and are actually being led to high levels of hysterectomy in those areas, because women are not allowed childbearing or period leaves in those communities, and they're undergoing various other stresses, beyond just the thought of just livelihood stresses. So just those vast levels of linkages. We think of their hysterectomies as just one event, but there's this large set of dominoes that tend to be unleashed in ways that we can't even imagine sometimes. So yeah, I'll stop there. Too much from my end.
I think that's almost like a really good example of where thinking using some of the futures techniques actually makes you think of the first order and the second order and the third order consequences. So you start thinking about, hang on, actually, what does this mean for something that, if you're talking about adaptation, you don't necessarily get to reproductive health naturally through a linear way of thinking. So it's really important to be able to do that, kind of make that leap with interconnections. Thank you. Sunanda, I wondered whether you wanted to come in because you came off mute.
Yes, I did indeed. Thank you. Yeah, I think Shruti's reflections were really strong, and lots to think about there. And like you said, the several degrees of impact of this, we don't normally tend to think about it when we plan for this, but it maybe we should. But no, what I wanted to come in with was just thinking about your larger question around infrastructure and technology, and that being one of the key sort of resilience adaptation solutions. In the kind of work we do as well, we focus on weather and climate information systems, but even there we see that one of the driving factors behind choosing this to be the most optimal solution seems to be funding. That seems to be a key driver of this, because where there is a, sorry, that's my cat drinking my tea. So it seems like where there are infrastructure or technology solutions, those are the kind of projects, or those are the kind of solutions that tend to get funded far more quickly than, say, more integrated, more behavior change kind of solutions. So I feel like funding mechanisms, there needs to be a fundamental shift in funding mechanisms and how that functions, because we know that these kind of development banks are also major funders. We have bilateral countries that are major funders. So I I think that's where one shift needs to happen. I think another thought in my mind, and I haven't really given this too much thought before this, so this is very shallow level thinking. I think when it comes to governments and governments driving infrastructure projects, I feel like it's because a lot of the expertise in government institutions are very engineer heavy. Like the people who work in government institutions are basically engineering, like their education is engineering, that is their specialization, that is their expertise. So their natural way of thinking about this is, right, what are the kind of engineering solutions that I can bring in? And similarly, with so many people having computer science or tech education, their natural way of thinking is, right, what is a tech solution to this that I can build? So I suppose what is in short supply, possibly, are behavior scientists or behavior change experts within these kind of institutions who can bring in that that perspective. But yeah, conversely, people like us in the kind of organization that we work in, that's probably the kind of gap we're filling as potential partners with governments. So yeah, those were the two sort of thoughts I had behind, I was thinking of when you raised this question.
So Nana, can I just jump in really quick and reflect on that? I think two really important points have come out that I can think of are, one is like, so who is kind of driving this scenario? Because you talked about the funders, you talked about, the people with expertise, and I put that in quotation marks because it's a very specific type of person, a specific type of power that these people have to make decisions. And it brings me back to something that I know about, like the Enlightenment rationalist movement, where it's kind of like we can control our own futures, we can build, and in urban planning studies, they talk a lot about the fact that we've decided that we can control nature. We can control nature, right? We can control how things will work. We are humans, we are smart, we are intelligent. We can decide the future. And you see this in a way in terms of especially colonial powers, how they've gone, they've built cities, in terms of the way they've canalized rivers, the way that they've like drawn lines to coasts. And we all know coasts are like very dynamic, fluid spaces. The fact that we've gone and we've said that we are controlling the way that the city is, I think this kind of builds on it with the new kind of technologies and infrastructures that we have. I'm not going to talk for too long. I have construction now, and it's going to give everyone ideas. So I'll be on mute.
If I can also just maybe add to that, I mean, in speaking of, the kind of these kinds of powers, I think some of the, like, if you look at structurally, some of the issues are also from what we see from our work is this issue with education and the kind of curriculum you get even in architecture, in technology, in planning, where, for example, if you look at architecture planning, a lot of it assumes almost a blank canvas that, the city, you're looking at the city yet to come, and you're not really thinking of the city that is already here. So we are not teaching people to think about how do you work with the existing material, how do you work with diminishing material, how do you then prepare for the future. You're thinking of as if it is a blank canvas. And I think that is why we have this problem of, and Ashali's pointed to some of the examples also, creating brand new cities, whether it's from reclaiming the sea or, taking over agriculture land, because that is where our education and our imagination has led us, not to kind of deal with what is there right now, but to build something completely and totally new. And when it comes to funding also, as I can't remember, I think it was Sunaina who mentioned it, and it is true, because these kinds of funders are also being drawn by governments who have to show something within the time that they're in power, right? And that is what, 4 to 5 years or whatever. So you're trying to build like what essentially is like a 50-60 year project in 4 to 5 years, and then try to keep your power, try to get re-elected so that you can see it through. So I mean, there is a huge mismatch in terms of aspirations, education, but also these other layers of politics and government and external funders coming in, like the various development finance bodies. So yeah, I was thinking that's something that I see within the structures and the mental models section.
I think Shuchi, you want to speak, and then maybe we can move on to the next scenario after that. Go ahead, Shuchi.
Thanks. Great. So I was just going to say, we at GRP have been doing some thinking around all of this as well, and we've been thinking quite a bit about power and working with power and how do we deal with it. And a lot of these issues, because we work on adaptation and resilience essentially, and a lot of these issues sort of stem at power and stem with power. So I mean, this was recent. This is something that's work in progress, and I'm sort of leading this along with a few colleagues. But there's a piece that I will share with the group that we're writing. But we're actually thinking about power in at various scales, and the first one is the power of expertise. So who we consider as an expert and who's considered as the community. That impacts how we think of what's the results, what's the intervention, whether it's even at the most local scale where an NGO extension worker may be working with communities, that may be farmers, that may be slum dwellers in a city, so on and so forth. But at each of these spaces, there's a power dynamic there, and that defines what interventions get implemented. There's also the power of discourses that Sunaina mentioned very strongly there, and we're also working towards something around that called the South to South Resilience Academies, where we're supporting Southern voices to come up with their own discourses, and these voices are necessarily from multiple disciplines, taking transdisciplinary approaches to arrive at those points or those voices that need to come out. And we're doing that with ACAD, so the organizing team should be aware of that. And the third thing is the power of geographies, who are the gatekeepers of that knowledge, right? What all the kinds of knowledge that we talk about in terms of engineering, technology-centric, technocentric, hard sciences, that are all very strongly Eurocentric, very centered in Western mainstream sciences, that have sort of diffused into a global mindset, primarily due to colonial legacies, and then due to a global the need for global aspirations, right? So there's that bit as well, and we're trying to change some of that with at the COP as well. We're trying to get we hosted the Resilience Hub. We were the managing partners of the Resilience Hub, and there was a very strong push for locally led adaptation and locally led adaptation principles. ACAD has been one of the strongest voices on that front. But we routinely sort of push voices from the majority world, people who aren't necessarily the ones talking, to be able to say their own voices, to be able to give their own point, and that sort of changes then therefore how solutions are perceived and how solutions are even conceived, for that matter. So power becomes a very strong structure, but also is a conscious mental model that we all can sort of work towards changing, and sometimes becomes political, but sometimes there are ways to change that and ways to change those narratives as well, without getting into the politics of power.
Great points. I feel like I've got quite a big question mark, because in this scenario in particular, it just doesn't feel like locally led adaptation if it has a natural place, if you get what I mean. It feels like if you're talking about the concentration of power and control, locally led adaptation would need to be almost like a kind of deviant in the approach. Whereas I wonder whether in other mindsets, other scenarios, it might have a more natural home. And what that does is it helps us sort of really, like, as you say, like question the paradigms, look at like, well, what actually does need to shift then for this to be meaningful in this scenario? Yeah, that's a really good point. Good. Work so interesting, Shuchi.
Thanks.
Shall we move on? This is fascinating, and I think we could go on forever. And we've got some really great thoughts here. Shall we look for some time at the other scenario? And I think we've already begun to segue into that, which is things like locally led adaptation, more ground up, bottom up shifts. And I can just read out what this scenario is about. And Bikram, Ashali, Anna just sort of do come in with what we want to, any sort of prompts and provocations. So this is what we're calling this ground up shifts. So imagine here we have a reflexive world where responses tend to be decentralized and contextualized, and elements of the mindset really at play here include a realization that there might not be a new normal, the world is very strange and volatile, previous ways of thinking and making long-term plans don't work. At the same time, we know that planetary and human health are deeply interconnected and there needs to be deep transformation. So examples of responses here could be about designing flexible, porous cities to live with and adaptively respond to issues like flooding, considering how communities at the core of things might be more resilient. And while there is potential for inclusive and transformative responses, there could also be some challenges, such as a lack of consensus on how to adapt. And so that's sort of the mindset at work here. And let's say some examples could be that many cities have activated a decentralized approach to governance and decision making. A number of municipalities and community groups work closely together to anticipate and respond to impacts and what cities need, including for physical and infrastructure or social support systems or ecological needs for that landscape. And let's imagine that community spaces of resilience are popping up across different cities, things like urban farms, community currencies, and means of exchange, household and community-based energy and water systems, open spaces in every city ward. And there has been a notable shift of residents feeling more empowered to act in their own interest across many cities. And we're also seeing that with more people participating, decision-making on the downside can often experience gridlock with a lack of consensus around how to adapt. And there are local power plays and politics that seems more intense at a personal and community level, and the attendant sort of risks of lack of accountability, instances of graft, or being overwhelmed by being responsible for making governance related decisions over and above their day-to-day burdens of daily life. And that could even lead to some disengagement among people. And there could another sort of downside of this could be a compounding of long-standing power dynamics, such as on the lines of gender or caste lines, as things become more and more local and more community directed. So that's just to set the scene of what this might be. And I know a lot of you are, and there is so much of emphasis on locally led adaptation and the transformative potential that it has. So let's unpack that a little more over here, starting with anything that you're seeing that we can draw on from what you're seeing today. Again, I think any examples from your work?
Maybe I could jump in with a little example from the work I've done. So we've worked, like I said previously, we work in the space of weather and climate information. So what that means is we work closely with national meteorological agencies and their services and products around forecasts. In a project we did in East Africa called the Raja, we worked very closely with local communities in informal settlements because the theory of change, or rather the logic there was if communities have the right kind of information in the right amount of time, they are better placed to take decisions, so anticipatory and protective decisions. Of course, they also need to have the capacity to take those actions and act on those decisions. Yes. So we worked very closely with multiple stakeholders in this instance. So on the one hand, the national meteorological agencies are absolutely key because they are the ones who are quote unquote producers of this information. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have communities and informal settlements who are consumers of, like users of this information. But there are also a number of different actors in between these two these two groups. So, for instance, local media or national media, or just like media in general, play a significantly important role in this value chain, as to your local authorities, as in your city councils and municipal authorities, etc. So we found that we did this in 2 countries, which is interesting because at the same time we were able to see the differences between 2 countries and how, as a country, like the cultures impact the way communities and these different stakeholders are responding to the same process. And we found that actually the government authorities were very keen on hearing from the communities and involving them in the kind of in overhauling some of the services and products that they were producing. So we use participatory methods. So we found that we had a fairly good experience in bridging these kind of disparate actors, but obviously the challenges of working with government doesn't go away. That's still there: the bureaucracy, the time, the limitations in funding, the limitation in technology, technological capacity, etc. All of that does slow down the process a little bit and does limit how much they can do. But yeah, I would say that in my experience, at least in this instance, there was willingness from government actors in wanting to hear from the communities, and they did their best, or they did what they could to incorporate communities' views and their suggestions into their services. So one of the outputs that we had from the project was redesigning the daily forecasts, and that in every stage of that redesign process, the community was there on hand to give feedback at every single step. So everything from like icons that were redesigned to the template itself, to the words that were used. So community was able to, with a little guidance, of course, because this is somewhat technical in nature, as in meteorology, with some guidance, they were able to provide feedback at every stage of the process. And so now the forecasts that are driving the system are user-centric, and people are able to engage with it. So yeah, that's just a quick example of community and government.
Thank you. That touched upon so many different levels over here. Anybody else, even including from the ICAD team? I know there are a lot of examples that we can draw from locally led adaptation efforts that we could use. Or even if you don't have examples, any sort of, it's about the imagination. So what do you think this might mean for different aspects of life? Maybe not just actors, but different aspects of city life.
I'm happy to share something. It's basically it's not a new model that has surfaced here, but actually a fairly old one that was put in the 1980s. But through our work, we found that it's actually one of the better models that we've seen in sort of, at least in Sri Lanka and in some of the other countries that we work in. And it was a model called the Community Development Council that was sort of introduced in the 1980s here, mostly to low-income communities when they were giving what was essentially small housing and fairly, basically people had migrated into the city without any proper housing. They were trying to develop settlements. And in each settlement, they had the housing authority at that time set up community development councils, which were entirely voluntary and comprised of people in that settlement. I mean, this is not a, I mean, this is a model that I think the previous speaker also spoke about, but for me, I think some of the more, some of the better features of this kind of a model included the fact that sort of community participation was really at the heart of it, and it meant that the community determined what it was that they needed. So it's really seeing the community as the drivers of the process and all the government institutions as the support. And that is something that we don't see at all now. We don't see community being consulted at all. They're usually sort of recipients of, you know, PowerPoint presentations that government planners and policymakers come and, you know, come and present to them. And here in the settlements that we work with, what we see is that women in particular have been given a fairly significant role. And here it is also because more women tend to be at home. They are the homemakers, and whereas the men tend to go to work and then they don't really have time to do sort of more community development work. So it is really the women who are the drivers of grid infrastructure, nutrition, everything from their homes to their communities. So it is really taking the more capable people and over here, and they are the women who know best. And they've been driving sort of access to grid infrastructure, from water to electricity, to even things like how the community should be designed, you know, whether there should be a playground, and even if there's water access in their homes, that, you know, even things like public wells of things like that, where they should be placed. And I think this is where the, you know, sort of the mistakes that we see in the current kind of models, where there are provisions of housing, low-income housing, public bathing areas, taps, communal spaces, but they're all designed in a way that are not safe for women, not safe for children, are completely inaccessible to certain groups. And that is because they have not sort of consulted with the final user. And here with the CDC model, we see that because it is community driven, they can then also access various other things. So it's not just accessing services, but over here in our municipal councils, each councillors have an yearly allocation called the development fund that they have access to. So by giving that kind of information to these community development councils, they then lobby with their individual councillors about how they should be using that pot of money to develop their electorate. Right to information, you know, getting information about various development projects. So it's really about not just sort of vertical planning and accessibility, but also about horizontal accessibility across institutions. And then how do we create those kinds of groups that are not also dependent on, say, a civil society group or NGO or anything, that they are sort of self-sustaining groups that can take forward, can, you know, reshape themselves, can change the format, but drive it themselves without being dependent on other groups to, you know, do the capacity building, do, you know, kind of like the middleman kind of stuff that we see now. So that's just something I wanted to share.
Thank you. And I had a question coming from what you shared about what were the conditions that enabled this to happen? And I'm sure those conditions were happening at different levels. Like, why did this model gain such traction when it did?
It was actually set up at a time and set up by a group of people who had a strong sort of inclination towards participatory planning and community-driven housing at that time. So this was in the early 80s. And so I think it was also political will. We had a president at that time whose idea it was. And then he brought together various groups of people, planners, sociologists, who then, you know, he put this team together, and then in turn sort of, you know, brainstormed and brought in the community at every step. So even when we kind of do the documentation now, they continue to talk about how that kind of expertise and experience, it wasn't very hierarchical. that the community was on the same level as the planners, but it was also that there was political will to do this kind of work also. Yeah. And sorry, and also the fact that you do see the results, like some of the better settlements that we work in Colombo are settlements that had these strong CDCs in the 1980s, and they still kind of continue to date to lobby for their community and their housing and their grid infrastructure. In that sense, is a lot better than communities that historically didn't have a CDC or any kind of community group.
Thank you. Shuchi, I can see your hand.
Yes. So I thought of a few examples as well from previous roles previous organizations that I've worked with. I was into implementation before this, more of a like a facilitator / knowledge broker now. But I guess even as an implementer, all of these processes are pretty much into knowledge brokering as well. Anyway, yeah. So this was 2012-13 when so I was at WWF, where we were working on the Ganga, conserving the Ganga in India, and this was in UP, and we realized there were a few different things. We wanted to work on cities, because cities weren't really the focus at that point, except for sewage treatment and pushing and courts pushing the government to install sewage treatment plants. There wasn't a focus on cities and the consumption of water or pollution from cities. So we started working in cities where we realized there was a critical data gap in terms of monitoring rivers. We didn't necessarily get the right kind of details from the pollution control board's monitoring, and so we started, and we also realized that there was due to the frequency of monitoring, what happened was there was no direct feedback. The pollution control board would monitor and then send back their data at a particular point. The court would call for it. Only when the court calls for it, there's a decision taken. Only when the court takes a decision would the government move towards some sort of action, which would be half-hearted and knee-jerk in any case. So, and of course, technocentric and not really keeping in mind the needs of wildlife, the needs of local communities who are directly resource dependent. So we started with something called river health assessments. These are fairly popular in biomonitoring, is fairly popular in countries like the UK, and the European framework, the Water Framework Directive, is sort of based on these qualities of good, satisfactory, bad. So there are these qualitative indicators, and that's what we did with this river health monitoring. And we trained community members essentially. This was citizen science at its start, and basically people became the sort of custodians of that data, one, and two, they started feeding that back directly to their either local corporators or local municipal government bureaucrats or technocrats. And to a small extent, what this did was this resulted into smaller quick fix solutions. So it wasn't necessarily large structural changes that came into play, but it really changed people's mindsets, where there was that tendency to for communities or generally urban citizens to say that, oh, the government should do something, or oh, the NGOs should do something, and we as citizens restrict ourselves to planting trees, and that's the only environment movement that we can really do, or we really do. So that was something that we sought to change, especially in cities and UP. It's changing now in India, with larger cities taking up a lot more of action around, and with social media. This was pre-social media times. or rather we had only Facebook, we didn't have Instagram, but things are things are picking up now with, Marine Life of Mumbai and very cool citizen science initiatives across, and Season Watch and in Bangalore, and very cool citizen science projects. But here essentially what we were trying to do was plug that gap in monitoring, where the feedback between policy and monitoring was very large, and that delay was very long. And it typically resulted in knee-jerk reactions. What we wanted to do was quicken that time, and we did that, and that worked, and that led to again. Now I hear from colleagues that they've gotten into leakage detection with citizen science. They've gotten into water footprint monitoring with citizen science. So things that don't get surfaced very easily because not many people talk about it. For the Ganga, it's the larger issues that come up. But yeah, these are small changes that make a huge difference. Another example, this is more recent, as recent as pre-COVID 2019, where we worked in Maharashtra on participatory groundwater and ecosystem management, where we realized that the mindset, there were two key mindsets. One, that water is needed for income, and therefore we'll keep getting more water, and therefore we'll keep having more storage capacity. Increasing storage capacity also, even NGO interventions in Maharashtra have moved towards that direction, have shifted, only focused on storage through desilting, through farm ponds, etc. And the other thing that people thought of was that drought is a disaster. We need to deal with it after it happens. We can't do anything before it happens, right? And we sought to sort of start changing that, and we did something similar. We did an exercise that was a causal loop diagrams exercise, slightly different, but the same concept of surfacing mental models and trying to change. Basically, we had a multi-disciplinary group of experts, community members, experts from different fields, including IIT Bombay, people who were hydrogeologists, people who were agriculture experts, institutional building experts, etc., and got them in the same room to talk about what their hopes and fears for their community were, and how we can alleviate that. And a few things that we found out, again, knowing how much groundwater they have made a huge difference in the way they planned what crops they need to grow. And again, the other thing, this was something that was already being implemented in other parts of the country, but the other thing that we added to that was knowing how your ecosystem helps your agriculture. So the direct link between agriculture and nature makes a huge difference. Farmers know that already, but they tend to listen to experts who don't know it. So if you talk to, we talked to farmers in Marathwada, and they told us exactly what we wanted to hear. So we were preaching to the choir when we were talking about the ecosystem, but it was the experts who don't really know it. And it is the experts who think of water as a, and because it was droughts, water was the primary variable that we were working for. And it was, farmers knew that the jungles were important. Farmers knew that pests can be removed with natural methods, and that wild boars came into their fields only because the jungles were being cut down or their commons were degraded. But it was the experts who did not know this. The experts were bringing in the pesticides and telling the farmers to use them. It was the experts who were bringing in, models that weren't necessarily suited to their ecology. So basically, that conversational aspect around getting the experts also to listen, and then we added that bit around mapping ecosystems along with groundwater. So monitoring groundwater
I'm going to come in because just in the interest of time, I think these are really, really valuable inputs. But I was kind of getting kind of lost track of time, but it suddenly dawned on me that we only have 10 minutes left on our
I'm
session.
so sorry about that.
No, it's really exciting. And I would love to have, we should definitely try to find a way to have some of these conversations with you.
Sure, absolutely.
As we move forward. So thank you
Very
so much
sorry
for that.
about this.
No,
Yeah.
no. Very interesting. So I just wanted to kind of, as we do have to kind of wrap up quite quickly, I wanted to bring in Karina. She's as a kind of to both kind of to reflect. So there, I have two things that are in my mind at the moment. I would love Karina to come in and kind of reflect a little bit on the two words that we have managed to create in this conversation. But also, there's this overriding question that we had, which is something that I've been seeing Salim and others who are organizers tweeting is, there's a very strong interest in thinking about the question of planned retreat and loss and damage, right? So also to see how that issue is featuring in these two conversations and world. Karina, over to you. I'll give you 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to do my best. And I was taking so many notes from all of these stories and case studies, because I think I'd love for us to find a way to just bring these to life somehow. Just parking this thought here, because I was making notes and I was like, oh, we should write this up. But I think as everyone was sharing stories and models and case studies, one reflection that came to me was that locally led adaptation actually shows up in all of the different models, but it might feel and look like very differently depending on which is the dominant mindset. Because you can have locally led adaptation actually in the climate proofing mindset, where you kind of see, national governments devolving decision making to the local level. Like that's not locally led adaptation, at its ultimate or deeper meaning, but you could really see how this language could be co-opted to actually say, well, this is locally led adaptation, like we are devolving power. You could also see it at sorry, I'm just letting my cat out. You could also see it in a different scenario, where we're talking about like the ground up shifts. And I think that's also where that also comes with its challenges, because I think there is this almost like assumption around what does negotiating and brokering power look like when we talk about municipalities devolving power and national governments devolving power to communities. So then there's a duty of care in terms of not putting too much burden on people who are already, like just living is enough of a challenge sometimes. And to have on top of that, the burden of making decisions, not just for your community, but for generations to come, I think is a lot without the support, without the infrastructure, without the backbone organizations that can just take on the admin, for example, or, who are the organizations or the supporting governance forms. And I think it was really interesting to hear the stories of the CDC around, how do we also automatize some of these processes? How do we create processes so that we don't reinvent it every single time when we talk about locally led adaptation, for example, so that communities can actually use, processes, ways to navigate conflict, ways to mediate conflict, manage tensions, because power dynamics are not equal within communities either. And how do we not replicate unhealthy power dynamics? And I think to the question of planned retreat and loss and damage, it was really interesting to see the earlier example of Jakarta, because I think that is a great case study and real life story of the challenges of planned retreat. So there is the plan of a new capital, and there's this, this phrase that has become quite dominant within the urban resilience community around your seawall won't save you. So it was really interesting to see the Great Garuda project, because that story actually came from the local communities in the kampungs who are being displaced to make space for the new development, and actually in this process of moving the capital, they are not put at the heart of this, moving or retreating program. So actually, you are going to move the capital, the most vulnerable people are probably going to be left in Jakarta. So they're going to be left with an even wider set of vulnerabilities to manage in terms of what is the local economy, what are their livelihoods going to be linked to. So I think there's all these complexities, but I think at a city level, it really doesn't mean that municipalities are off the hook or that formal actors are off the hook. But I think there's a rebalancing of ways of knowing and valuing local and traditional knowledge to say, well, actually, we need to actually put these people at the center of decision-making processes and of implementation processes, but they should not take an extra burden to actually run these and be in charge of them and then be held to account. So I know that it's really hard, but it's almost like I think this is the key tension to figure out, like, what is the process that can help us achieve these two things? So I'll stop here because I know we're short.
I think that thanks for that. Romy, I have the same set of questions for you. Your reflection a little bit on the two worlds, but also this idea of planned retreat, and how that might play out in kind of urban planning and future cities.
Sure. I guess when listening to this session, some of the things that would answer your question that I was also thinking about were thinking of also prioritization, and say when it comes to budgets, we see particularly in this part of the world, in South Asia, the kind of shift more and more over the years to things that we consider non-essential, but governments consider essential. For example, defense. We see huge defense budgets. And less for education, less for housing, less for education, things like that, but hugely inflated in other ways for things that are really are not so much the priority. So in that sense, like, how do we then ensure these kinds of equitable budgeting processes where things that we do need to have, like an equitable city or a more sustainable city, do get funded, as opposed to sort of the whims and fancies of policymakers and politicians who decide on this kind of extravagant funding. And again, when it comes to talking about budgeting and money and this conversation around compensation, and the example that I can use is a very concrete one from Colombo, where we have the Port City project, where it's 200 acres of the sea that has been dredged to create a brand new city. So we see the city being built right now, but the environment consequences of it's humongous. And from the beginning, the community that has been sort of experiencing it the most has been the fisher community in the coast. And then this conversation of, we've compensated for their loss, we've compensated for the fishing loss. But how do you compensate for something that is 20 years to come, where you don't know changes in the fishing patterns, changes in the type of fish that people are catching, the volume of fish? And then you're not also accounting for all these other things, but you're assuming that your compensation for right now is adequate for the communities to be affected for the future, and also communities yet to come who may not be affected right now. So in this building of this kind of a new fancy smart city, or any of the examples from Amaravati to anywhere else, like, we are really thinking of like the consequences of right now when we're thinking of things like compensation and scenario planning or mitigation. But how do we then, kind of think of it in the long term? And the other thing I do always think about is about the changing aspirations of the younger generation. People who are planning now and living in these cities are not going to be there when it comes to fruition, if it ever comes to it. And aspirations of younger people are changing. We see that again in South Asia, where younger people do not want to, for example, keep working in agriculture or more, sort of mechanized, sort of factory kind of work, because they haven't seen that kind of upward mobility in the lives of their parents. So you see less and less younger people wanting to take up farming. And even when you talk to these developers who are planning these various, development projects, they always say, we have these jobs as gardeners, as drivers, as waiters. But that is also assuming that these younger people that you are looking at right now are aspiring to become drivers and waiters and, gardeners. They aspire to other things, and that is what education brings. So, and then again, that goes back to my previous point of, the gap in education. Are you really building a generation of people for this city to come, and what are the jobs that we're looking at? And are they ready to kind of face the climate issues and all the other infrastructure issues that these cities are going to bring? And I guess finally, my point is down to with regarding energy and whether we are, how our cities and our policymakers planning for the city, for the changes. Like, for example, if you just take heat, in any of our cities in South Asia, they're a lot hotter than they were 10 years ago. Does that mean that for the city, do we need to then plan for an air conditioning unit in every single house and every single building? What is then the burden on the grid that is already unable to power the existing power energy sources? And then how do we then think about the making this an entire sustainable setup? Do all those additional air conditioning, even if they say they're powered by solar and not a burden on something else, they're still doing some kind of a harm to the environment. So again, like future planning and, kind of like not like imagining what that future is going to be like, and then what are we doing right now in various aspects, from governance to education to curriculum, to even just taking aspirations into consideration, which may not be, it's not tangible, right? Things like something like aspirations. So those, I think, were just the main points I thought of while we were having our session today.
So thanks very much, Romy. Unfortunately, there's so much, so much more that we can talk about, and it would have also been great to kind of. I mean, I was saying this to my colleagues on the side that we should redo this because we have 4 mindsets that we want to explore, and we also want to kind of dwell on it a little bit more and have more time. So we have to find the opportunity to maybe in person, like do a physical event to think through these ideas that have come out today. So I just want to kind of thank, obviously for us, again, I'm a bit retarded technically, so I don't know who was making that comment, but there was a very interesting comment on mapping of power systems and which I thought was really interesting, because I think that was in some sense the idea behind our framing of this particular program, is that or the agenda or even the abstract, that we are quite interested in the plural visions of resilience that exist out there, which we discover in various forms in our work, but also concerned about the power dynamics through which particular visions are coming to dominate, right? So that's really and how do you and I fundamentally see an exercise like that as an attempt to mitigate that power, and find ways to reveal and bring out the plural imaginaries against the kind of more dominant ones, and mitigate those sense of power. And that's, I think, to me also remains the core of what this sort of work can bring, in addition to obviously to being able to specifically chart out trajectories and ways of moving forward. So I think with that, I just want to kind of close this session. I really want to thank particularly Ashali, Yamini for putting it together, obviously Anna and others, and for Gobeshona for selecting our panel, and for ARA for selecting our panel. And I really want to connect with all of you again, and I want to do this, I want to have this conversation in more detail, in more depth at another occasion, and we will find that occasion. I have actually been messaging the Adaptation Research Alliance that they have to now create that opportunity, because we have thought through how to do this, and I think it could really work well. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, everybody. I think we have 5 minutes over, which is fine. do we have anything else from, I saw that, anything from ICARD, or can we just say goodbye to everybody?